Back in this conversation. This is a pretty intense conversation. We've been talking about this conversation. If you haven't go back and look at our YouTube channel. You can watch all the ones before this. But this conversation is this place in which Jesus is talking to his disciples, and in this gap between the Lord's Supper and the time he's arrested. And I just believe the conversation was a conversation that the disciples remembered really vividly and thought about over and over again. I mean, if you think about this, these are the last words they hear, and they're at a spot of real vulnerability, and so they're trying to take this in. And what we see Jesus doing when he's talking in this conversation, he's basically giving them confidence for what's coming, and he's showing them it's going to get better, and so he's saying these things in place, and what he's doing, he's putting down anchors to say, you need to have these anchors when I leave the earth. This is how you should live. And so as we listen to what he talks about this whole thing of saying, you have to understand that the first thing you need to understand is you need to know how much I love you. And he says this crazy statement, I love you as the Father has loved me. That's the anchor. And he goes on to say, now, the relationship will not stop. It'll continue on. In fact, it's going to get better. It'll be like a vine and a branch connected, like that. And the key thing is that you stay connected. And the whole way through, from the very beginning, he keeps saying this one thing over and over. Here's how you do well. You love others as I have loved you. Those are the anchors he's putting down. Now he's getting to the spot and saying, by the way, as you start living this life of loving and testifying, you're going to have some people hate you, and you're going to have some people who are come against you because they did me as well. So you can expect that. And so now he's in the spot of kind of telling them a little bit like, it's not going to be easy, and he's helping them understand that so they don't fall away. And so as we move in this text, this is the context. They're thinking they know he's leaving, and he keeps saying it, and they're trying to get their mind wrapped around it. And he says this right here. If you want to follow along, you can. So we're going to be talking today about this whole thing of grief. And now he's going to be helping them understand you're going to grieve. That's a really cheery thing. Like, you're going to cry. And it's going to get really good. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. So if you want to turn over to John 16 through 22, or just follow along on the screen if you like. And this actually, I think, helps us understand more what's taking place. In John 16, it says this, starting with verse 16, it says, Jesus went on to say, in a little while you will see me no more. And then after a little while you'll see me. At this, some of the disciples said to one another, what does he mean by saying, in a little while you'll see me no more, and then after a little while you'll see me? And because I'm going to the Father, they kept asking, what does it mean by a little while? We don't understand what he's saying. Jesus saw that they wanted to ask him about this, so he said to them, are you asking one another what I meant when I said, in a little while you will see me no more, and then after a little while you'll see me? Truly I tell you, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. And he goes on to explain what this is like, and he uses the example. He says, a woman giving birth to a child has pain. I've heard this happens. Because her time has come, but when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because of her joy that the child is born into the world. So with you, now is your time of grief. But I will see you again, and you'll rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. Now, many times you have an idea of how life is going to go, right, in your ideal moments. And so many of you have seen this on the internet. This is kind of, what it's like, and then what reality is. I think I found a more theologically correct graph for this, right? I think it's more like this, right? The expectations, and we all kind of knew that. But in that spot is understanding that we actually have a life that goes up and down, and it goes around, and there's places of great sorrow in this life, and there's places of great joy. Now, life on earth has deep grief and great joy. That is something we just got to lock in. If we're living on this earth, we are going to experience some deep grief, and we're going to some great joy as well. Grief in this place of loss and pain and sorrow and sadness. and great joy, and we rejoice in those things. And both is part of life. You know, I think the 22, I'm just going to read that again, 23, 22 says, very truly I tell you, you will weep and mourn while the world rejoices. You will grieve, but your grief will turn to joy. A woman giving birth to a child has pain because her time has come, but when her baby is born, she forgets the anguish because her child has been born into the world. So with you, now is your time to grieve. But you will see me again, and you will rejoice, and no one will take away your joy. Now those words in there, when it's talking about grief and mourning, and this place of like even weeping, you might remember the shortest verse in the Bible, right? You guys know that one? Jesus wept, right? That actually is a different word than this. That means he felt compassion, he shed a tear. The word here is the way you would say grief would be to weep aloud, to inexpressible, uncontainable, audible grief. All right? That would be the best way of describing the word there. And this place of mourning or lamentations, this lament that we go through, it's basically to cry out loud, to mourn, to wail, especially audibly. In this place of grief, to experience deep emotional pain and sadness, sometimes severe sorrow. It's intense, and hence it's even used in the term of childbirth. That's the same word they'll use. And so what Jesus uses as an example here. Now, your natural response to loss is grief. We're made that way. It's when something, and we talk about loss, it's something's taken away, right? Something you expected to take place does not take place or taken from you. And so if you think about the disciples at this point, and think of what it felt like, knowing that Jesus they deeply love and put their whole life on the line, is going to be leaving them. And you think about what it felt like, and their paradigm of what they thought of the Messiah, and what that was going to look like, and watching him get arrested and beaten and mocked and crucified. We're talking about sorrow and grief. You know, they're at a spot in which as they watch that, they really, you know, we can look ahead, right? We can, you know, they couldn't see the resurrected Jesus yet. They couldn't understand what was going to happen and what we were reading about in Acts 2. They couldn't possibly see that this was their time of great grief, right? Now, and then Jesus uses this example of childbirth because he's saying that's just part of life. This is this thing of grief. It's a place that you have pain, and then some joy comes out of that as he tries to describe it, right? All of us suffer and have sorrows. Whether we're on this earth, we will always have that, along with the joy as well. Now, in fact, you find that actually in Scripture, joy and sorrow are always kind of connected together. One brings about the other. It's this place of turning our mourning into dancing. It's this place we see throughout Scripture. You know, for me, so what do you guys think about that? Are you excited that I'm talking about sadness and grief on this nice sunny day, right? I mean, but I think this is really relevant for where we're at in our life right now. I think that I've found that this place of kind of Americanized Christianity, you know, it often just kind of jumps over pain, right? I don't know about you, but I found that often in the churches I attended, they didn't talk much about sorrow, especially when they talked about Jesus. I remember the first time I heard Jesus referred to as a man of suffering and sorrow. I thought, don't say that about Jesus. You know, he's perfect, you know. No, that's my example. Don't mention that. I didn't know it was actually biblical because I had never heard much about this. And then we look at this place of Christianity. We actually have theologies within Christian churches that see expressed grief as lack of faith. Or maybe just something that's very unhealthy emotionally that they don't want to see. It could be just a distorted view of like, we just don't go there, right? And yet it's all the way through scriptures. We see it all the time. And what I find is it's really this thing of actually taking our sorrow and expressing it boldly towards God is something that's hard for people. You know, I'm pastor, so I'm at funerals a lot. Often I'm the first guy in after the death to talk, and so I've seen a lot of pain at those times. And what I've watched over and over is the struggle to express the pain, right? I mean, I understand what it's happening. Either it goes to anger, or they just start shutting down, and it's difficult, right? And they begin kind of wanting to jump ahead to the joy, and I know they need to grieve, and I think we all can struggle with that. I think they have a hard time. You guys know what I mean by this? Embracing sadness, embracing sorrow. Now, you know, when I reflect on my own life, Debbie and I have hit some hard things early on in our marriage, but I'm telling you what, it's taken me a long time to really understand that the need to be able to grieve with God, the need to be able to embrace pain and letting God come into that. I'm still not sure I'm great at it, but I'm telling you, I remember this process we've gone through, and you know, it's because many times it's just something we have to kind of relearn. I was raised in the 50s and 60s. Some of you more older people and understand what I'm talking about, right? 50s and 60s, I'm sure it's true now for many of us, but my being raised, I didn't have much room for emotion, right? You know, I think I would have, like, if I was not doing good physically, then they would say, hey, we need to take him to the doctor. If I was behind in school, they'd say, well, you need to catch up, and we need to help you on that. And even spiritually, they gave me some direction. But emotionally, it's kind of like, you can figure this out, can't you, Dave? That's kind of how and that's true for most people. And so at this spot, when we have that, sometimes it's very difficult because we don't see it in even our spiritual, how we're looking at it, and emotionally, how we're raised up, it's difficult to do that. You know, I think the first time that I saw deep grief being expressed was when I was in grade school. And we got a call my grandfather had died suddenly. He was actually in the hospital, expecting to come home at any time, right? And instead, he died. And it's a total shock. And she lived quite a ways away, so we spent a long time in the car. We got in the car, we drove all night to go down to Aurora, Missouri. And so we could, when she got up at 5:30 in the morning, she always got up early, we'd be there to tell her that her husband had died. So I remember getting out of the car, walking in, knocking, seeing her come to the door, beaming with joy. And then we said, Grandpa's dead. Frank's dead. And I watched my grandmother, I wasn't used to this, come apart. She began wailing and wailing and wailing. And it got to a point where I was just like, oh. And I remember throughout the week, she would turn a corner, and then she would see his robe, and then she just began wailing, grieving. You know, so we go to the funeral home. She throws herself on Grandpa in the casket and begins wailing. I'm telling you what, it was grief. It was pain coming out, full speed. And I remember in the service, I was in the service, and I'm sitting there in the service, trying to get together, and all of a sudden my emotions start catching up with me. And I start shaking, and I start choking up. And my dad lovingly set his hand on my shoulder, and I knew what that meant. It meant, be strong, hang in there, right? But really what I needed to weep loudly, expressing great grief and pain, right? And the disciples are coming up to the spot that they're going to have this huge loss, and Jesus says, you have to understand, this is your time to grieve. But there's joy coming. And he wants them to understand this not just for this time before his resurrection, not just this time before the Pentecost comes. He's wanting to understand because he wants them to understand this is how you live on earth. You need to understand this is how you live well on earth. And we need to understand it as well. The thing about Jesus is he experienced sorrow and deep grief himself. So if we want to be like Jesus, we should be people who experience what he experienced. That's what you'll find. And as you look at this, and look in Isaiah, it says, he was despised and rejected, a man of sorrows, acquainted with the greatest grief. We turned our backs on him and looked the other way. He was despised, and we did not care. Hebrews says, during this time, and during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries, tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience through what he suffered. You know, Jesus is a spot where he understands that he was someone who knew how to grieve. He knew what it felt like. And he was perfect. And so when he says, now I'm going to die, and here's what I want you to do. You know, I want you to grieve. He didn't say, you'll be tempted to grieve, but don't grieve. Stay strong. He said, you need to grieve. And they needed to know that. You know, and he explained even how painful it's going to be. While you're grieving, everybody else is going to be celebrating that I'm dead. It's going to be really hard. And so, what we have to understand is this applies to every follower of Jesus. We need to understand that we can find God, we can experience God in our deepest sorrows. God embraces us in our sorrows and grief. Now, when I was about in my 30s, I was in Palo Alto, California, and we had a retreat, a men's retreat down in Santa Cruz, California. And I remember my dad had been diagnosed with cancer, and I was already going through lots of stuff, and God kind of working things through with my dad, and so I was pretty raw in that area. And I got pulled out of the meeting, and they were calling me from home, and they said, your dad's in the emergency room. He may not make it. Looks pretty bad. And I remember just this sadness, just this stuff coming over me. And so I thought, okay, what would I tell? I was a pastor, so I thought, what would I tell someone else to do? Go cry, grieve, okay. So I went in the woods, I walked around the redwoods, prayed a little bit, cried a little bit. Okay, I'm done. You know, that's it. So then I go back and everybody's broke from the meeting, and they're all hanging around eating in this room, and it's packed out. These guys are laughing and talking, and I remember I walked into this room, and about the time I walked in, and I saw my friends, all of a sudden this it just started coming up inside of me, and someone must have noticed that something wrong with me, so they grabbed me, and they took me to a cabin, two really close friends, and they laid their hands on my shoulder, and I wailed. I cried at levels I've never cried at before. And they said nothing. They just laid their hands on me and stayed with me. And I thought I was done, and more would come. And pain was just coming out directly. And I remember in that spot of their thinking, this is so embarrassing and so good at the same time. And I remember crying in this place of this sadness that was there. And here's how it felt like. If you can imagine a small child being overwhelmed and falling into his parents' lap and weeping, and the parents just taking them in and loving this child until the point they get to a place that it's all out. And then they don't say anything until after it's all out. Then they can talk a little bit if they want to. That's what it felt like. It's an expression of love. There's nothing that a parent loves more than having a child who puts their trust in that spot. There's nothing better than that. And that's the way God feels as well. Now, the good thing is, too, is that when we do it, it has this tremendous payoff. I mean, it's not just neutral, like I'll get through it till something good happens. It actually has this redeeming quality that God does these amazing things in this process. First off, it was what I remember, the burdens that you're carrying that you shouldn't be carrying get transferred. And that's such a great feeling. Then you also have this place where you feel his presence. And you also have, the circumstances may not change, but you actually have this different hope. You know that something good is coming, even though it's hard. There's this other place in which that when you start learning how to take your pain and turn to God and your suffering and allow him to come into that, it just allows you to realize that you don't have to be afraid of the future, right? So even right now, some of you are just really afraid of what's coming. The future is because you realize now after COVID, after 2020, anything can happen, right? I mean, it can be crazy. It can get worse. You really can. And you know that now. It's like, I don't want to think about that. But if you understand that even if it gets hard, even if more pain comes, you understand that it connects you to God. It doesn't take you away from God. You don't want it, but you no longer fear it anymore. And you can start living in a way that you couldn't before. Now, it really is a place that in those moments which we trust God in the areas of our pain and sorrow, and when we come into with our pain and turn to him, it really connects us to him in a way that it increases our faith and our trust. I mean, Jesus, perfect, our model of how we live on this earth, he learned obedience through what? Through suffering. What does that mean? He's perfect. It means that he grew in greater and greater degrees of trust, even though he's perfect, because in this place of struggle and suffering, he turned to God each time. And that's part of how he grew and grew in greater and deeper relationship with his Father. We see in Romans where it talks about this place of it produces these amazing things. It produces this place of perseverance and character and hope just by being in it, right? In Romans 5:2 it says, we boast in the hope of the glory of God, not only so, but we also in the glory of our suffering. Because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. And it just puts this spot where, I don't know how this is hard to put into words, but you'll see this over and over in Scripture, is this process we go through of having places of pain and suffering and loss, and God coming into that, and then we come on the other side of joy. It makes the joy even more complete. It causes you to be able to see life through a place of gratitude. It causes you to be alive in ways you couldn't have been before. It has this place of allowing you to see beauty you couldn't see before, right? You find yourself in a place of gratitude. But the final thing I think that it does, I think is kind of the most important one, is this, is we are given a deeper capacity to love and enter into the suffering of others, right? When you're not doing well, you know who you want to be around? Someone who's been through pain and is doing good with God. That's who you want to be. They carry something that they've gained through this process. It's this place, it's talking about in Corinthians, it says, praise be to God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and of all comfort, who comforts us in our troubles so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received from God. For just as we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, so also the comfort abounds through Christ. So when you, not only do you get to experience the comfort of God, it gives this capacity within you then to pass it on. All the things that you've experienced pain in, God always will redeem to be the place of your most powerful ways of loving other people. And when you understand that with God next to you, you can enter into people's pain. I mean, here's the thing is, the reason we have a hard time loving people, because to truly love a person, you have to enter into their world, which is often a sad world at times. It's a painful world. We know we should, but when we try to do that within our own strength, it doesn't work. But when we've experienced this place of God can come in this, it gives us courage to be able to have a capacity to go into people's lives and go into places that you couldn't have possibly gone into yourself, and bringing the comfort of God, bringing the presence of God, bringing the truth of God in that spot. Of just, my two friends brought Jesus to me as I sat there by just laying their hands on me, and God came through. And we can be that to other people as well. And I just say this is pretty relevant right now. There right now is a lot of loss. And this works on the full continuum of any loss, all loss, big loss, small loss. But there is a lot of loss that we have right now. A lot. And there is sadness from that loss. And there's a place of pain and sorrow in some of the things we've lost. There's things that are just very difficult right now. And we need God to come in that with us, right? We need a place in which that we can begin letting God come into that place of loss and bring his comfort, to bring his presence, to do things in us that we need now. We need him to take off our burdens, but it's that risky thing of being willing to yield to him by being real and honest with him. And so the invitation is pretty straightforward. Welcome Jesus into your pain and sorrow. That's a choice you have to make. Are you going to do that or not? And the way you welcome him in, a couple things I just saying is, I found it's hard to welcome him without saying it out loud. To really state where you're at when you pray and get raw with him and tell him your pain and let your pain come out. And I found also that many times that's difficult sometimes without another person. So sometimes you'll need another person alongside you just to say what's going on. And the thing I'd say is this, is it will feel a little bit like me being a 10-year-old at my grandpa's funeral. This is going to be a scene. I don't want to do this. I'm telling you, if you start feeling God's compassion and you begin doing this and you feel emotional, lean into it. Cry your heart out. Weep loudly. Don't let culture tell you that you're weak or this is not faith. This is worship. But we have to make that choice to do it. And the second is just really just enter into someone else's pain and sorrow and bring God's comfort to them. Bring God's hope to them. You know, you can do that right now. As you have people you find yourself seeing, understand that you don't do this by yourself, but you go in and you can bring God's comfort to those people by just showing up and entering into it with them. And God will stay with you. And you'll experience God and they'll experience God.